Okay, let's get started with the view. If you'll just click on the address bar and do Control O, Command O, and find that file that we saved. And I open it. Right now it doesn't have anything, of course. All right, let's do this 8x8 grid of green squares. And I'm actually going to fake the black borders around these by just having a black background and then putting green squares on top of that with gaps in between. So let's start with the black background. And we'll give it a style. And in the style, we need to define the position to be absolute. We need to define its leftmost position to be 0, its topmost position to be 0. We need to give it a background color. And we need to give it a height and a width. And let's just start with 500 by 500. Okay, let's refresh that. So we've got a black background there. And now let's draw the green squares. And we're not going to do this using HTML because that would take a long time, and I want to make use of a loop. So let's just do that inside of the onload function of our JavaScript. We'll make a function called drawGreenSquares. All right, I really want to help you understand how loops work, and this is one of the best ways to do that. I'm going to show you how to do a loop of a loop in order to draw 8 lists of 8 cells. You know what, better yet, let's start with just one cell. Let's just draw a cell. So if I say var green square equals document.createElement div. And I'll have to add that as a child to our black background element. And to make that easier, let's actually create a reference variable for the black background element. And we can just do that up here. But then inside of our onload function, we need to assign it to have the value of the element with that ID. Okay, so now I can use that variable by its reference. I can say black background dot append child green square. Okay, that's not going to do anything yet because our green square doesn't have any CSS. It's just an empty div element. Let's say green square dot style dot position is absolute. And let's say its width and height are 100 and 100. And then we need to give it a background color, and let's make that green. If I save this and refresh it, see we have a green square there. Let's also see if we can position that because we're going to have to put that in a different position for each square anyway. So for now, let's just make its leftmost coordinate 0. As well as its topmost coordinate. And that's not going to change its position because it was already there, right? But you'll notice if I change this to be like 100, 200, now it'll put it in a different position. So I can use these left and top attributes each time. As soon as I put this inside of a repeating process, I will have to change what these left and top attributes are for each of the elements, for each of the cells of this grid I'm creating. And one thing you might have already noticed is if I'm trying to make an 8x8 grid and the entire width of this is only 500, then I should probably have smaller squares. So let's try 50 by 50 for now. All right, so we know that we can draw one cell. Why don't we put a loop around that and draw a whole row of cells? Let's start with an iterator variable, I, starting at 0 and going up to 8. If I refresh this, you'll notice it doesn't change what we see. And that's because they all still have the same left and top attribute. But if I were to change it so that each time it draws a cell, it relies on the current value of I when it chooses how far left to draw it, then you'll notice it's actually putting out more than one element. So let's say instead of having it always draw it at position x equals 100, let's put it at position 50 times whatever our current I value is. And now you can see it put 8 green squares all right next to each other so that there's not even a gap between them. Let's make it so there is a gap. Let's say plus gap, and let's create a variable for that. Let's say gap equals 5 for now. Let's see if that's good. Oh, we'll also have to put that gap inside of our 50 plus part, inside parentheses. There we go. And that might actually be too big of a gap. We'll work on that later. Now let's make another loop around that so that it does a whole list of rows. So we'll have 8 rows, each having 8 columns. And it would probably be better to rename the I variable column. That way we don't get confused when we start using these iterators to define how far from the left and how far from the top to draw these things. So this is just representing which column we're iterating over currently. So now let's put another loop around all that. And this is going to be a variable for the row value, starting at 0, while row is less than 8, row plus plus. And then we will indent all of this that's inside of our row iterating process. And now we're going to have to change the top as well. So instead of having all of them draw at 200, as you can see, and it looks like I forgot to name that one as well. Okay, so you'll notice we still have just one row of green squares. And that's because we didn't change the top attribute. So each new row is just being drawn exactly on top of the previous one it already drew. So instead of having all of them draw 200 pixels from the top of the screen, let's change this to rely on our row variable. And now you can see we've got our grid there. One thing we should do though is change it so that we don't have all these 50s here. Let's just make that a variable. And let's call that cell width. The reason we do that is to make it easier to change the size of the whole grid just by changing one value. Watch this. When I change the cell width to be 60 and I refresh the page, it resized and repositioned everything accordingly. Although you might have noticed the background is still the same 500 pixels by 500 pixels. We can change that too. Inside of our onLoad function, let's just say right after we get the reference to black background, let's set it to rely on the cell width. Okay? Let's say black background.style.width. Instead of equaling 500 that it started out as, it's going to immediately change to be whatever our cell width is times 8 plus the gap times 8 plus 1, which is 9. Let's try that. So the width is correct, so let's just do the same thing with the height. There we go. So now we've effectively made it so that if we change this value right here, the cell width, to be, say, 80, now the entire grid updates accordingly. It's beautiful. We can also change the gap. We can say gap, instead of being 5 pixels, let's make it 2 pixels. It still works. So that's why we want to use variables as much as possible rather than just having the actual value. It just makes it really easy to change things around later. I kind of like the value 3 though. Let's try that.